Welcome to the channel. Today we'll be delving into a chilling case set in the quiet town of St. Mary's in early 2003. Our story involves a seemingly normal man of God behind doors secrets and a twisted plot for murder. Father Michael O'Donnell was a man of God known for his piety, eloquence and sermons, and his dedication to the small town of St. Mary's. But behind the facade of holiness lay a secret that would unravel into a tale of betrayal, lust, and eventually murder. This is the story of a priest who found himself entangled in a forbidden love affair, leading to a deadly confrontation that shocked the entire community. Michael's weekly sermons were filled with warmth and wisdom, and his dedication to the church was unparalleled. Since his youth, Michael had known that he was different. Growing up in a strict Catholic family, he had always felt a deep connection to the church, a place where he found solace from the confusion that haunted his soul. As a teenager, he began to realize that his feelings towards other boys were not the same as those of his peers. These feelings were not something he could easily dismiss, yet he knew they would be condemned by the very institution that offered him comfort. Believing that a life of service to God would help him suppress these desires, Michael entered the seminary at a young age. He dedicated himself to his studies, hoping that his devotion would cleanse him of what he saw as sinful thoughts. However, as the years passed, the loneliness and internal conflict only grew. His prayers for deliverance went unanswered, and the isolation he felt became a constant burden. Michael's early years as a priest were marked by an intense struggle between his faith and his forbidden desires. He threw himself into his work, trying to fill the void with service to his congregation. Yet every time he heard a confession about love or lust, a pang of guilt pierced his heart. He would spend hours in the chapel begging for the strength to remain faithful to his vows. But the loneliness was always there, lurking in the shadows. Despite his best efforts, Michael could never fully escape his inner turmoil. His nightly prayers became more desperate as he pleaded with God to take away the feelings that plagued him. As the years went by, those feelings only grew stronger, setting the stage for the temptation that would eventually lead him down a path of destruction. And it all started when he met Jonathan. It was a warm summer evening when Jonathan first walked into St. Mary's. His eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and admiration as he gazed at the church's architecture. Michael noticed him, immediately drawn to the young man's vibrant energy. Their initial conversations were innocent, revolving around art and philosophy. Jonathan, an artist by trade, was fascinated by the church's stained glass windows and the stories they told. He would often spend hours in the courtyard sketching the great details of the building. As time passed, their conversations grew deeper, moving beyond the physical beauty of the church to the nature of faith, love, and existence. Jonathan was different from anyone Michael had ever met. Open-minded, free-spirited, and unafraid to question the world around him, he was a stark contrast to the rigid beliefs that had shaped Michael's life. Michael found himself lingering longer after Mass, hoping for a chance to talk to Jonathan. Their discussions became the highlight of his day, a brief escape from the turmoil that constantly churned within him. Jonathan, in turn, was drawn to Michael's intellect and the quiet strength he seemed to possess. There was an unspoken connection between them, something that both excited Ed and terrified Michael. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the church, Jonathan asked Michael to join him for a walk. They wandered through the quiet streets of the town, Their conversation flowing effortlessly for the first time in years, Michael felt at ease as if he could finally be himself. But with that comfort came a dangerous closeness, a closeness that Michael knew he should resist, yet he couldn't bring himself to pull away. The turning point came one night in the rectory. They had been discussing a piece of art that Jonathan was working on, a portrait of a saint that he wanted Michael's opinion on. As they stood close together, looking at the sketches Jonathan had brought, their hands brushed against each other. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through Michael's entire body. In that moment, the years of repression and loneliness crumbled, and he found himself leaning in his lips, meeting Jonathan's, in a kiss that was both passionate and desperate. From that moment on, their relationship became something more than friendship. They met in secret, stealing moments of intimacy in the church's secluded corners. The forbidden nature of their affair only fueled their passion, making each encounter more intense than the last. Michael was consumed by his love for Jonathan, but with that love came a growing fear of being discovered, fear of losing everything he had worked for, and fear of the wrath of a God he could no longer understand. Sister Agnes, a devout and observant nun who had served at St. Mary's for decades, began to notice changes in Father Michael. His sermons were no longer as fervent, and his demeanor had shifted from serene to agitated, suspicious. She started to watch him more closely, and what she discovered confirmed her worst fears. One evening, she followed Father Michael to the church's rectory through a crack in the door. She saw them, Michael and Jonathan, locked in a passionate embrace. Shocked and horrified, Sister Agnes retreated, but she knew she couldn't stay silent. The church's reputation was at stake, and she felt it was her duty to report what she had seen the next morning. She confronted Father Michael. She implored him to repent, to confess his sins, and to end the affair before it led to further scandal. But Michael, torn between his love for Jonathan and his duty to the church, was paralyzed by indecision. He begged Sister Agnes for time, promising her that he would make things right. Father Michael was desperate. He knew that if the affair became public, his life as he knew it would be over. But the thought of losing Jonathan was unbearable. As days passed, the pressure mounted. Sister Agnes was growing impatient, warning him that she would take matters into her own hands if he didn't act soon. In his desperation, Michael started to come up with a plan that was both risky and dark. He realized that the only way to protect his secret was to get rid of the threat. If Sister Agnes was no longer around, no one would be able to reveal the truth about him. But could he really do something so terrible? Late one night, Michael found himself pacing the rectory, consumed by guilt and fear. He drank heavily, trying to drown out the voices of doubt and conscience. It was then that Jonathan arrived, noticing Michael's distress. Michael confessed everything to him: his love, his fears, and the terrible plan he had been considering. Jonathan, shocked and horrified, pleaded with Michael to abandon the idea. He loved Michael deeply, but couldn't bear the thought of him becoming a murderer. But Michael was beyond reasoning. The alcohol, the guilt, and the fear had taken control, and he was convinced that there was no other way. The night of the murder was cold and dark. Father Michael had arranged to meet Sister Agnes in the church under the guise of confession and reconciliation. She agreed, believing that Michael was finally ready to repent. As she knelt in the confessional, Michael approached her from behind. He hesitated, the reality of what he was about to do hitting him like a ton of bricks. but in his hand he held a rope, a symbol of the twisted and desperate plan that had taken root in his mind. Without warning, he wrapped the rope around her neck, tightening it with all his might. Sister Agnes struggled, gasping for breath. But Michael was relentless. The strength of his guilt and fear fueled his actions until finally she stopped struggling as her lifeless body slumped to the ground. Michael fell back, horrified by what he had done, but the horror was not yet over in his frenzy. Michael had overlooked one crucial detail. Jonathan had followed him, desperate to stop the madness. He had arrived just in time to witness the gruesome act. Michael, realizing that Jonathan had seen everything, was overcome with panic. He tried to explain, to justify his actions, but Jonathan was in shock. He couldn't believe that the man he loved, the man who had brought him so much joy, had just committed murder. Frantic, Michael begged Jonathan to help him cover up the crime. He argued that they could still be together, that they could escape and start a new life far away. But Jonathan was torn. He loved Michael, but couldn't reconcile that love with the monstrous act he had just witnessed. Eventually, Jonathan relented. Driven by a mixture of fear and loyalty, together, they wrapped Sister Agnes's body in a heavy cloth and carried it to the church's basement. There in the darkness they buried her, hoping that no one would ever discover the truth. Sister Agnes's disappearance didn't go unnoticed. The next morning, when she didn't appear for morning prayers, the other nuns grew concerned. A search was conducted, but there was no trace of her. It wasn't long before the police were called in and an investigation was launched. Father Michael did his best to act normal, but inside, he was falling apart. The guilt was consuming him, and he began to unravel. His sermons grew erratic, his behavior increasingly suspicious. Jonathan, too, was struggling. The weight of the secret was too much to bear, and it began to affect his art, his relationships, and his mental health. The police investigation intensified. They interviewed everyone at the church, including Father Michael. Though he tried to remain calm, the detectives sensed something was off. They noticed his nervousness, his evasiveness, and the inconsistencies in his statements as the investigation progressed. The pressure on Michael and Jonathan grew. Jonathan, unable to cope with the guilt, started drinking heavily. His once vibrant and passionate demeanor was replaced with despair and self-loathing. He became distant, and his relationship with Michael deteriorated. One evening, after a particularly intense argument, Jonathan stormed out, leaving Michael alone in the rectory, desperate and afraid. Michael reached for the bottle, hoping to drown his sorrow, but the alcohol only heightened his paranoia. He became convinced that Jonathan was going to betray him, that he would go to the police and confess everything, driven by fear. Michael decided that he had to act before Jonathan did. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police closed in on him, and he couldn't allow Jonathan to be the one to bring him down. The final confrontation took place on a stormy night. Michael, his mind clouded by alcohol and fear, confronted Jonathan at his apartment. The argument quickly escalated, with Michael accusing Jonathan of planning to betray him. Jonathan, heartbroken and exhausted, tried to calm Michael down, but it was no use in a fit of rage. Michael grabbed a nearby object, a large ornate dildo that Jonathan had used in his art, and struck Jonathan across the head. The blow was powerful, fueled by Michael's fear and anger. Jonathan stumbled back, dazed and bleeding, realizing what he had done. Michael panicked. He knew there was no turning back. With shaking hands, he took the same rope he had used on Sister Agnes and wrapped it around Jonathan's neck, choking him as tears streamed down his face. Jonathan's body went limp, and Michael collapsed next to him, sobbing uncontrollably. Earlier, a neighbor had overheard the commotion and, alarmed by the sounds of struggle and shouting, called the police. The officers arrived quickly, their concern growing as they approached the apartment and heard Michael's muffled cries through the door. They knocked and called out to him, but there was no coherent response. Only more sobbing. Realizing the severity of the situation, they forced their way inside as the officers led him out of the apartment. Something in Michael snapped. He broke free, grabbed a nearby gun from an officer, and fired wildly in his panic. The bullets hit one of the officers and a bystander who happened to be passing by the building. Chaos erupted as the officers shouted for backup and struggled to restrain the unhinged priest. The sound of gunfire echoed through the apartment complex, sending neighbors into a state of fear. Michael, now fully consumed by his madness, retreated into the apartment. Barricading himself inside, his mind was clouded with desperation and guilt, leaving him unable to think clearly. The police quickly surrounded the building, their weapons drawn, as they tried to negotiate with Michael from inside. They could hear his frantic shouts, the disjointed ramblings of a man who had lost everything. The entire building was evacuated, and a tense standoff began for hours. Negotiators pleaded with Michael to surrender peacefully. They assured him that they didn't want anyone else to get hurt, but his responses were erratic. He spoke of God, his sins, and the overwhelming guilt that had consumed him. He blamed everyone, Jonathan's sister Agnes, even the congregation, for his downfall inside the apartment. Michael's thoughts raced. He knew there was no way out, that his life as he knew it was over. But the idea of facing judgment from the police or from God was unbearable. He felt trapped, both physically and spiritually, with no escape in sight as the standoff continued. The tension grew. The police feared that Michael might lash out again. Endangering more lives, they prepared to storm the apartment, knowing they were running out of time. Inside, Michael was reaching his break point. The reality of what he had done, the lives he had taken, the sins he had committed, crashed down on him with unbearable weight. He looked around the apartment, at the bloodstains on the floor, at the remnants of the life he had shared with Jonathan. All that was left now was despair as the police prepared to breach the door. Michael made his decision. He picked up the gun once more, knowing that he had only one option left. He whispered a final prayer, asking for forgiveness, though deep down he knew that forgiveness was beyond his reach. With a trembling hand, he pointed the gun at the door, ready for the inevitable confrontation. The door burst open and the police stormed in, their weapons trained on him. But Michael didn't fire. Instead, he turned the gun on himself, ready to end his torment once and for all. But before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, striking Michael in the shoulder and causing him to drop the gun. The force of the impact knocked him to the ground, and within seconds the officers were on him, wrestling him into submission. Bleeding and defeated, Michael was finally subdued. The apartment was a scene of chaos, officers shouting, the wounded being tended to, and Michael lying on the floor, his body racked with pain. He was handcuffed and dragged to his feet, his eyes glazed over with a mixture of pain and resignation. As he was led out of the apartment, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The officer he had shot lay dead on the pavement, covered by a hastily thrown blanket. Nearby, the bystander, an innocent man caught in the crossfire, was being loaded onto a stretcher, his life hanging by a thread. The crowd that had gathered outside watched in stunned silence as the once respected priest was escorted to the police car. There was no more shouting, no more gunfire, only the heavy silence of a tragedy that had unfolded before their eyes. Michael didn't resist as he was pushed into the back of the car. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He simply sat there staring blankly ahead, his mind finally numb, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a vice. But there was no escape now. All that awaited him was judgment. The news of Father Michael O'Donnell's arrest spread like wildfire through the town of St. Mary's. The congregation, once filled with admiration for their priest, was now torn between shock, anger, and disbelief. The church that had once been a place of solace and peace was now tainted by the horrors that had taken place. The trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against Michael was overwhelming. The bodies of Sister Agnes and Jonathan, the testimonies of the officers, the recordings from the standoff. He was found guilty of murder, attempted murder, and assaulting law enforcement officers. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole in prison. Michael was a broken man. He no longer prayed, no longer sought redemption. His days were spent in silence, haunted by the faces of those he had killed, by the life he had destroyed. The love that had once brought him joy had turned into a nightmare, one from which there was no waking. The town of St. Mary's slowly began to heal, but the scars of what had happened would never fully fade. The church was closed for a time, and when it reopened, it was under the guidance of a new priest, one who worked tirelessly to restore the faith of the shaken congregation. As for Michael, he spent the rest of his days in solitary confinement, his mind trapped in the endless loop of guilt and regret. The priest who had once been a beacon of light had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most devout souls. There was no redemption for Father Michael O'Donnell, only the cold, unforgiving embrace of the sins he had committed and the lives he had destroyed. Could Father Michael have found another way to protect his secret without resorting to murder? Was Jonathan's decision to help Michael cover up the crime driven by love or fear?